Today I'm going to use Blender to create an object with a procedural texture that I bring into Procreate so that I can paint on it and then bring it back into Blender. So a little while ago, I did a video where I brought an object from Blender into Procreate, I painted on it, and then I brought it back into Blender to show that the texture could come with it. But people asked, how do you go back and forth? How do you bring a texture from Blender to Procreate, back to Blender, and so on? So today, I want to create an object in Blender from scratch, give it a procedural texture, one made from math, put that procedural texture on a texture map, bring it all into Procreate, paint on the texture map, and then have it return safely to Blender. So let's get started. I'm going to start by deleting the default cube, and then I'm going to take an overhead view with number 7 on my number pad, then bring up a Bezier curve and enter edit mode with tab. With my vertices selected, I'm going to hit V and I'm going to choose vector. This is going to make moving around and modifying my curve a lot easier. I'm going to move one of my vertices over, and I'm going to use E to add more vertices to the end of my shape. I really just want a really basic shape for my vase that kind of bulges out to the side and then comes up to the top. That's good enough for now. I'm going to use tab to exit back into object mode, and I'm going to add a Bezier circle. Now that the Bezier circle is here and I have my profile, I'm going to change the names of my original Bezier curve to Vase profile, and I'm going to change the Bezier circle to Vase. With my new Vase object selected, I'm going to move down to the curve section. I'm going to drop into the object, and I'm going to choose my Vase profile. And now I have a really primitive version of my vase. I'm going to change my view here, give myself a split view so that I can see my vase from 2 different angles. And in my original view, I'm going to select my vase profile and use slash to isolate, and then 7 to do a top view, and then enter edit mode. Now I can move around my vertices, and using V and modifying how I want the Bezier curve to be handled, I can make changes and shape my vase how I'd like it to be. Doesn't really matter what it looks like. It's pretty hard to mess up a vase. There's so many different types that you could have. I like having this little bubble on the bottom to give it a bit of a foot. And there's the basic shape of my vase. I'm going to collapse my view. Now my vase is really very thin, so I'm going to give it some thickness by adding a solidify modifier. And I want the solidify modifier to have a 0.1 thickness and an offset of 1. Now it's got some depth to it. Now it's time to turn my curve into a mesh. So I'm going to convert to mesh. Now when I go into edit mode, I can actually see the faces that are part of this vase. I'm going to move down to the mesh section and normals, and I'm going to choose auto smooth so that I can see all of the sharp edges to my vase. The lip of my vase has a kind of squared off edge, which I'm not too happy about. So I'm going to use Alt Shift to select the 2 rings that make up the lip, and then I'm going to use edge bevel. And I'm going to find the right depth of the bezel, and then I'm going to scroll with my mouse wheel to give it some nice curve to it. And get just the right size. And now it's got a little bit more softness to the edge of that lip. Now it's time to give it a basic texture. So I'm going to split my view again, and I'm going to pull up the shader editor. And in the shader editor, I'm going to give myself a new texture and call it a vase texture. And I'm going to add a Voronoi texture and connect the color to the base color. To view it, I'm going to use texture view. And there we have some interesting colors on my vase. I can make them bigger or smaller. I'm also going to add a texture coordinate node, and I'm going to choose object as the node to pull from the texture coordinate node and connect to the vector node. And now my chunks of color are a little bit more evenly distributed. It's almost like I carved the vase out of a bunch of melted crayons. Now, switching over to the UV editor, I'm going to take a look at what my UVs start off as. You can see that they're super uniform, as that's the default way that it takes a Bezier circle and applies UVs when you convert to mesh. To see this in action, I'm going to bring up a new image texture, have Blender generate one for me, and I'm going to give it a lot more resolution, 4096 by 4096. And just to show what's going on, I'm going to use the UV grid. Here's my UV grid pattern, and my UVs automatically scale to fit. If I go back to my shader editor, I'm going to add an image texture node. And I'm going to use my new vase texture map and connect the color. And you can see how uniform the UV grid looks. But you can see that in some areas it's kind of squished, other areas it's a little bit more balanced. Some areas the squares are really small, and some of them are so small because the faces on my lip are so small that it kind of just melts together and turns gray. This isn't exactly what I want. I really want my UVs to be roughly the size that they are in 3D space. Some of them are bigger and smaller. So I'm going to use Smart UV Unwrap. And now I have a much more even distribution. Even in areas towards the bottom or top of my vase, these UV grid squares are bigger. And if they have to take up multiple faces, then they do it in order to maintain roughly the same size. Returning to my shader editor, I'm going to go back to using my procedural Voronoi texture. And I want to take this texture and I want to put it on my texture map. I want to replace my UV grid with all of these lovely colors. So I'm going to select the texture map node in the shader editor, and I'm going to be sure that my object is selected. Then go to the scene panel. I have to have cycles. Cycles is the only way I can do this right now. I'm going to go down to bake, and I'm going to get rid of combined for the bake type, and I'm going to use diffuse. I don't need direct or indirect lighting. I just want the color information from the diffuse texture, and then I'll click bake. Down here you can see that there's a progress bar that takes time to fill up, and it'll take longer or shorter depending on how complicated your geometry is. And there it's done. It took me about 30 seconds. I'm going to go back into my UV editor, and you can see all of those colors have replaced my UV grid. One thing I have to do is be sure that I save my new baked image. It is possible to lose this information if you're not careful, so I'm going to save that image in the same folder that I keep my Blender file. Back to the shader editor. I'm going to replace the texture color, and it looks the same. But it's not exactly the same. If I put my Voronoi texture back on for the color, and I zoom way in, you can see my colors are razor sharp because they're procedurally generated. But if I use my texture map, you can see the texels. We need these texels because that's what Procreate is going to paint on when we move it over to Procreate. But ideally, it would be better to have my nice, crisp, procedural textures if I were doing, say, an animation or something like that. So let's leave the texture map connected. And let's take a moment to look at metallic and roughness. These two properties will also be transferred when I export for Procreate. And if I mess around with metallic, it changes the way the color is handled. And if I use roughness, you can see I get a nice, shiny, reflective surface. This kind of high metallic, low roughness always reminds me of a Christmas ornament. Whatever values you choose will convert to a flat, gray texture in Procreate for this particular aspect of the material. If you choose 0, it'll be a black roughness or metallic. If you choose 1, it'll be white, and anything else in between will be gray. I think I want mine to be a little bit rough and not at all metallic. Now I'm going to be sure to select my object, go to File and Export, and I'm going to choose Universal Scene Description, or USD. You'll note that there's a little asterisk after the D because if you type in the name, and put the extension as USDZ, it'll actually export all the images and the geometry as one file, all packaged together. Now when I import into Procreate, here's my slightly shiny, colorful vase. I'm going to create a brush that's going to act as a gold paint texture. So I'll head down to the materials section. I'll choose a blank source with high metallic value. And for my roughness, I'm going to choose a low roughness value. And I'm going to change my source to be blank. Okay, I'm done with that. Now I'm going to choose a slightly orange yellow, and I'm ready to paint in gold. I'm going to paint with gold on the lip of my vase just to show a little bit of what's possible. Remember that when you paint in Procreate, it will paint exactly what's inside of the circle. So I want to angle my vase in such a way that I don't end up painting on the inside by accident. Then I'll take some time to paint the inner side of the lip. I want it to kind of look like somebody took the vase, turned it upside down, and dipped it in gold. But I don't want the line to be too perfect. I want it to have some character. And there it is. Just enough so that when we export it back to Blender, we can see whether it worked or not. Then we're going to go up to the wrench and export as a USDZ. I'm going to email it back to myself, and I'm back in Blender. I'm going to combine my viewport for a second and move my vase over. And now I'm going to import the file that I transferred. Now that it's in here and you can see the textures came with it, you'll notice that the geometry is a little off, and that's because the vertices are not actually connected. But there's an easy way to fix this. First, I'm going to head over to my mesh section and find normals and turn on auto smooth. Then I'm going to enter edit mode. And I'm going to select all of the geometry with A. And then I'm going to choose merge, and I'm going to choose merge by distance. That'll connect any vertices that are close enough or overlapping. And now you can see I have my vase just like it was in Procreate. Shiny with its gold lip. If I divide my view and I bring up the shader editor again, you'll notice that Procreate has modified my texture. For base color, roughness, and metallic, there's now an image texture that's associated with it. So what do you think? Following those steps will allow you to go back and forth between both programs, creating procedural textures, which can be really helpful, but then also being able to paint on top of them in Procreate. I hope you enjoy. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'll see you next time.